This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm ready to go, am I? I may go. Hello, everyone. I'm Douglas Busfine, Politico's Trade and Agriculture and Food Editor. We on the trade team like to think of this session as the tasty filling of the Politico Summit sandwich. We're following this morning's session on competition, and things wrap up tomorrow with our session that concludes with defense and cybersecurity. But, as the saying goes, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And as you can see from the title of our session, there may no longer be such a thing as free trade, hence the brackets around the word free in the title of this session. So what is going on in the world? Well, Europe's relationship with the United States has been overshadowed by the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act, which foresees billions in subsidies for green tech made in the USA, like electric vehicles. Trouble looms on steel, and if a deal can't be reached by October, those Trump-era tariffs could return. And Europe's relationship with China is cooling rapidly. We have entered an era of de-risking, but apparently not decoupling. And just last week, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen announced a new economic security strategy. It's supposed to be country agnostic, but we all know it's about China. And Europe is becoming a fortress. The EU seems to be pursuing protection in all but name, from supply chain due diligence to the carbon border tax, from anti-coercion to investment screening. And now there are calls to investigate Chinese electric vehicles and potentially impose anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs. If these are imposed, that could trigger an all-out trade war. And what about all those trade deals? Mercosur, Australia? Europe needs to diversify its trading relationships as Russia wages its war of aggression on Ukraine and China menaces Taiwan. But where are the handshakes? Where are the signing ceremonies? The champagne corks aren't exactly popping. Well, we hope to find some answers in this afternoon's session, and we have a great lineup for you, starting with the panel discussion being moderated by our senior policy reporter, Barbara Moens, on whether the EU's policy toolbox on unfair trade competition is strong enough. But before we get started, I'd like to thank our partners for making this summit possible. Our leading partners are Google and Santander. Our presenting partners are Cisco, PKEE, and SQM. And now, just a few housekeeping rules. You can ask questions through the Swapcard platform. If you are in the room, you can scan the QR code on the screens. Otherwise, check the instructions you can find on our event website. If you're already on the platform, feel free to chat with fellow attendees and ask questions in the question box to the right of the screen. If you are on a desktop, and below the live stream, if you are viewing on your mobile, I hope you've got that. For some sessions, our moderators will tell you if you have the chance to ask questions in person. We like debate. Please talk about us on Twitter or the social media of your choice. Our Twitter hashtag is, in one word, Politico Competitive Europe. And now I'd like to make way for Barbara and our distinguished first panel. I'd like to wish you a free-flowing and stimulating afternoon of trade talks. Barbara, the stage is yours. High five.
Thanks, Doug. Hi, everyone. Hi, welcome here in the room and those of you following online. As Doug said, my name is Barbara Moons. I'm our senior trade correspondent. And I'd like to invite our first panel to the stage, Mr. Reinhard Bütikofer, German Green MEP, Mrs. Marie-Pierre Vedren, French Renew MEP, and Isabelle Van Dam, partner at Van Baal and Bellis. Welcome. Oh, sorry. Excuse me, that's my earplug that that I still need, I think. Thank you all three for joining here in the room. We'll be discussing the EU's trade toolbox. I'd just like to remind the audience that for this session, at the end, the last 10-15 minutes, we'll have questions, but just inside this room, so we'll close the live stream at that point. I'd like to start with this week and the upcoming European Council on Thursday and Friday, where EU leaders will discuss China and the new economic security strategy. As Doug said, it's country agnostic, but we all know that it is about China. So, Mr. Bütikofer, I would like to start with you, if that's okay, given your passion to talk about China. What do you make of this new economic security strategy?
Thanks for having me, first of all. I would say it's a good next step in a relatively long series of instruments that we have developed over the years since 2016. I would say 2016 was a really important year for European trade policy and in particular for China policy. And there's now a long list of trade defense instruments, and the new strategy doesn't really impose a new philosophy. It just takes the efforts to the logical next step. However, as we have seen also in the past, in the European Union, agreeing on trade policy is never easy. Some of the instruments that we have adopted, and Marie-Pierre and I have worked together a lot on that, ran into stiff opposition from some capitals for a while. And the same seems to be happening now. The last draft conclusions that I saw for the summit does not yet contain language that explicitly endorses von der Leyen's economic security strategy. That's not by coincidence. Obviously, maybe, I don't know who, maybe Berlin, maybe Paris, maybe they have to think more. I welcome the strategy. I think it's important to signal to all our partners that we keep marching in this direction.
But you could also argue that it's not a surprise. There is new language specifically on an outbound investment screening instrument, which touches on national policies. Maybe, Ms. Van Dam, you can touch on that. You know, how far do you think the Commission is going with this new strategy? How far-reaching is it?
Yeah, maybe just first picking up on what was just being said, it's indeed the case that this new strategy paper, it provides an inventory of a lot of things that were already happening, but there's at least two main new initiatives that are put forward: the reform of export control and dual use, and the second one would be to work on outward FDI screening. I don't think this will be so easy to achieve. Why? Well, first of all, it's not that you can take the FDI screening mechanism we have today for inward screening and just create, as it were, a mirror of that for outward FDI screening. It's just not that easy to do it that way. It's also the case that FDI screening, as we've seen, is not that easy to do. It involves, as things stand, still member states often, and the EU has recognized that we need to revisit that perhaps, because it's a very fragmented system we currently implement. And then I think that in designing such a scheme, we'll have to address very sensitive questions. For example, do you want to target investment going to any destination or or particular countries? What type of investments do we want to screen? If it's about technology and research, maybe export control is a better tool to do that. If it's about export of capital, how will you enforce any type of screening mechanism? And then are there supposed to be any thresholds that apply in terms of the amount of the investment? What will the grounds of review be? And at the end of the day, who will do the screening and take the decision? And building on what was also already mentioned, you know, we talk about all of this as being part of trade policy, but there's a very sensitive question arising about the intersection of national security and trade policy, and there's a foreign policy and the common commercial policy. And it was interesting to hear that when the strategy was proposed, that I think the Vice President said, well, we don't want to enter into a battle of competences between the member states and the European Union. But I would say it's probably unavoidable that such a sensitive discussion needs to be held.
A lot of questions. Maybe you have some of the answers because you were at the forefront of a lot of these trade instruments together with Mr. Boutikofer. How does this screening has to look like?
First, thank you for your invitation. Like Renard, I think that, and like you said, it's a good moment to have this new presentation and this new strategy because we faced a lot of challenges. So now it's time for the EU to concretely not be naive. We say all the time that we are implementing our toolbox, but in the reality, we see that it's always been difficult with member states, with the European Commission. We have seen during the negotiation on anti-coercion how it was very difficult with the Council. So now I think that, as you mentioned, on FDI, we need to move forward because if we don't be able to have a unity of European Union, in fact, it's not possible to react against unfair competition, against a not level playing field, but also about coercion, because it's not only a question of competition, it's a question of limitation of our sovereignty. And I agree with what you said about it's a trade policy, it's also foreign affairs policy. We need coherency between all our policy. And we know that, of course, trade policy is a big tool. So sometimes we expect a lot of trade. So it's also on the end of the Council. If they really want to defend all the European interests, we need to move forward and to strengthen our toolbox. But the key question will be the implementation, the enforceability. All the time is the question. This morning we have the hearing about New Zealand. Yesterday we talked about the European strategic autonomy. We know that the real question in the implementation and also all the power we give to the Commission to really implement all this toolbox.
And maybe on that, if we can take a step back, this commission has built a lot of these new instruments. France was one of the forefighters to ask for these instruments, also the chief trade enforcement officer. So if you look back at this commission, you know, how would you evaluate that and what work do we have to do now?
Yeah, it's true that for France it was we push a lot for this kind of move. The Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, IPI, FDI, the new strategy. I think we win a political battle. But like I said, I think that now the question is implementation and how we work also with all the stakeholders. Because I think I see in my region in Brittany also the impact, for example, on anti-dumping policy. If we are not able to help our SMEs work with European country, but also with the Commission, we are not able to implement. So I think we have some gaps. We continue to have some gaps. So it's why I think, okay, the political battle is win in order to defend our interest, in order to push the concept of open strategic autonomy, sovereignty. We have always some question about how, why, but I think now the key question is how we do this. And I think that the Commission play a key role, and sometimes, and it's the role of the European Parliament to push European Council, and also Renard mentioned Berlin, mentioned Paris. We have to push some member states, especially, to really move forward on this action. And we have also, for example, a lot of questions on the infrastructure, because we have also this question, because we know that some member states are also weak because they are afraid about the consequences of retaliation. So if we are not able to protect them, of course they don't want to move forward. So it's I think that we play a key role in the European Parliament, but we need to continue to push, especially member states.
Yeah, and maybe on to dive into some of the specific instruments, we had another step today with the anti-coercion instrument. Mr. Bütikofer, you said if that instrument is to work, it needs to be a dog that not just barks but also bites. Do you feel that with the instrument we have now, whether that's the case, and where do you look at concrete examples to start using this tool?
Well, we didn't construct that instrument in order to use it as often as we can. We hope that it will have some deterrent effect.
Yep.
And I'm quite happy with what we got effectively. There was a huge controversy. There were two controversies between the Council and the Parliament. Number one, who calls the shots? Who determines whether we think there is coercion that we must react to? And the second question was, which kind of tools will we have in our armory?
Yep.
And the compromise resulted in the Council being the institution that determines whether there is coercion, while the Parliament was successful in insisting on keeping some of the bigger guns in the armory. I think that's a fair deal because, frankly, if you want to risk going to a trade war, you have to have the member states on board anyhow. The Commission on its own, even with support from the Parliament, cannot organize a trade war if France and Italy and Germany and the others don't want to march. So having the member states involved in the decision in the first place makes some sense on substance. On the other hand, if we can deter, hopefully, because we have some good cannons in the toolbox, maybe we don't need to go to that end. What I would want to clarify, though, is two things. This instrument has been based on a legal basis that is trade, exclusively trade. And I think we should stick to that. And second, there is no way of using any trade defense instruments, neither those that we have already in place nor those that we think about, for the purpose of changing the balance of decision-making powers between the Commission and the Council. The investment screening mechanism that is now being seen as a big success would have failed completely if we had insisted that the Commission should dominate the mechanism. It was a necessity to allow the member states to take the decisions whether they want to implement that tool or not. And I think that same logic will prevail also with regards to other instruments. So no over-centralization will ever be successful in on these issues.
Okay. Mrs. Van Dam, how do you look at the anti-coercion instrument from a little bit of an outside perspective?
Yeah, it was clear that if the EU wanted to address coercion, it needed an instrument. And the notion of coercion is very widely defined at the end in the instrument. The European Union also says this is very much based on international law. But in practice, I think if the instrument is to be applied in a specific case, that the burden will be very high to actually show that there is coercion. So although it's very broadly defined in the instrument, I think if you want to apply it in practice and maintain that the instrument has a strong basis in international law, that it's a very high burden of proof for the EU institution.
I would say Lithuania would have been a case.
That could have been a potential example. That case, of course, is now being argued in the WTO, and we'll see how what the decision is there. But of course, in using using all these instruments, and I think we now have many different tools to respond to possible challenges, it's always a cost-benefit analysis, and you have to think, I think retaliation was already mentioned. Retaliation can take many different forms. We also see that many of the EU's trading partners are now thinking also about coercion and anti-coercion measures. So we can never exclude the risk that if the instrument is used in a particular case, that it might have a kind of snowball effect, of course. And it was already mentioned the risk of this tit-for-tat kind of trade war that would start. So I think the instrument has to be used in practice with a lot of caution.
That's a comment or criticism that we get a lot also from, for example, developing countries, that we have this weaponization of trade and the EU is catching up, going along with it, which, has a deteriorating effect on overall global trade policy. So what would you, I'm sure that you get the same questions or criticism. How do you respond to that?
I have effectively the same question, especially because I'm French. So
they're blaming you.
Yeah. And I think that this kind of ambition, first, is not protectionism. And we continue to say that with all our third partner and third country. It's very important to say that now, and at the beginning and the introduction, you say that it's a message for China. Yes, true, but first I think it's a message for Europe. Now, since a long time, we are always focused on openness, and with the trade policy review, you say that now we have three pillars: openness, sustainability, and also assertivity. And in fact, there is assertivity because there is openness. But if you have only openness and no assertivity, you have also not credible to our some partner. For example, I focus on US with the relation on China. I think that also US expects that EU have some trade tool in order to defend the rule-based system. So I think it's also a matter of credibility. If we are, it's true that maybe there is some risk, so it's why the implementation is very key. And always we are focused on proportionality, on deterrent effect. So always we say that to our third partners, it's a question of credibility outside the EU and also inside the EU, because we have also a lot of expectation to our stakeholders, to our SMEs, to our citizens, to say that now Europe must defend its own values, its own interests. So I think it's why it's a good way, but effectively the question of implementation is key.
Do you want to respond to the criticism of a fortress Europe that the EU is building? How do you look at that?
Well, I find that nonsensical. I really can't imagine a market that's more open than ours is. I mean, you can always plug arguments from thin air, but I'm really not sure it makes a lot of sense to discuss that then. We are certainly shying back from protectionist measures that have been on the table. When we agreed on the investment screening, for instance, there were proposals on the table that this should be turned into an industrial policy instrument. Yep. We refused to do that. We restricted the application of that instrument to cases where public order and national security are concerned. That's very moderate, I would say. And the same kind of approach applies because we understand full well that Europe benefits from open trade. And we have withstood what I would call it an ideological challenge, where people were trying to create perspectives that withdrawing behind walls would be helpful. It's not been helpful in the past, and it wouldn't be helpful in the future. Europe's strength is built on partnering inside the Union and partnering with other players outside the Union. And I think that's the dominating philosophy. So let's not discuss scarecrows.
Let's shift to another debate then, from the more geopolitics to the nitty-gritty of some instruments. This morning we had the EVP Vestager on, who talked, amongst other things, about foreign subsidies. And she acknowledged that when it comes to the foreign subsidies regulation, that there are not enough people in the Commission at this point to implement this, which was kind of a known secret, I think, for those following. Why is that? And if there were enough people to work on this in the near future, where do you think the EU should take specific actions when it comes to foreign subsidies?
It's true that I think that Margaret Vestager is right to be focused on these challenges, because since a long time, and also in the European Parliament, we say that we know since the beginning that we don't have enough person to implement this kind of legislation. Maybe, I'm not sure that it's a right place to say that, but sometimes I have the feeling that in Digitrade there is a lot of people focused on new FTA. Maybe sometimes we have the opportunity to change the responsibility on some people on Digitrade and to be focused also on this. And also sometimes we go back with Chair Lange to Indonesia. I have also the feeling that in third country we don't have enough members on European services, on Digitrade, also in place if we want also to work not at the end of the process, and because always the European Union promotes dialogue. If we want also to really have a concrete and tangible change, we need to work since the beginning of the process. So maybe we have also to have a reflection on the coherence between all the DG,
And maybe specifically also on this instrument, because we're now, as we said, moving towards implementation. How do you think it will work, for example, on the notification thresholds? Some say they're too high, they're too low. How do you see the next steps of this foreign subsidies process?
I think that during the negotiation, we try, and Renat says the same for the other tool, we try to be really moderate and to have always the proportionality on all the steps on the process. So now maybe we have also to work with member states, we have to work with stakeholders, because when you discuss also with enterprise, they said that it's too much bureaucracy. So it's true with... je trouve même plus mon mot en français. With the deadline of implementation, we have also to see and to react on all the process.
Yeah.
We were not quite united when we discussed thresholds. Socialists and us would have advocated for lower thresholds. We didn't find majorities. I think we're now in the process of collecting experience. The jury is out. Were we right? If so, reality should prove. Were we wrong? Just the same. So I think it's too early.
Okay. Maybe, yeah, I was also looking at you for a reaction, but also on, the potential impact on investments into Europe, whether you can say a couple of words on that.
Yeah, maybe first of all, in terms of the learning experience that needs to happen, we're of course dealing here with an instrument that was initially the idea was we should do something about foreign subsidies of China. And that was clear. There was a lot of pressure to get it adopted, and we ended up with an instrument that has an effect across the globe, and that needed to be adopted and implemented then very fast. And I think that helps to explain maybe the fact why its DG Competition is not fully prepared to receive all the notifications and then start with the actual investigations. Of course, for businesses, it means that doing business in the EU will become more costly, it's more intensive kind of process to get the controls done. Often there are merger controls that have to be completed. It might be combined with FDI screening in certain sectors. And overall, it's a lot of work for companies to do the due diligence and collect the information. We do see that in the implementing regulation, the Commission is now already trying to kind of manage a little bit that problem while working on some of the thresholds and saying maybe some types types of financial contributions do not need to be notified. So we'll see, I anticipate through the implementing regulation, maybe the Commission trying to, I wouldn't say shrink the instrument, but at least try to make it more manageable. And then it will be a learning experience, but at some point we'll have to see if the regulation itself needs to be amended to make sure it's more practicable. And also we talk about this now on a trade panel, of course. As I said, it's primarily DG Competition that will be administering this instrument, but it'll be working in part with some notions that are more kind of familiar for trade, the DG Trade, such as the notion of a subsidy, how these investigations will be run. So hopefully we'll see that there's some kind of expertise that is being shared between the different DGs, as was already mentioned.
You still want to? Yeah, go ahead. Maybe to go a little bit more into, what all these instruments can now be used for. We've recently reported that France is pushing the Commission to look into Chinese electric cars, Chinese medical devices. If you would advise the Commission what to look into, what would it be, and can you say a little bit more about that?
It's true that we have challenges with electric cars. I vote in favor of this regulation and on the 8th on 2035. I think it's very important to move on this issue, but we know that we face a lot of competition on this, especially Chinese, because we are, since the past, we are not able to be present in all the value chain. So now we have the NZDA, we have the CRM Act. So also we need to move forward on this in order to be completely prepared. When we discuss with industrial, they say that they are ready, some, but not all. So it's true, we have the question of the competition because we are not able to have an offer for all our citizens. So I think my country has right to push for an investigation on this.
Anti-dumping specifically, right?
Because it would be very damageable for the EU, I think. But we know that it will be also very, very difficult to move forward. Maybe some member states are not completely on this way. So I think first we need also to discuss with all the member states to say that it's very important for our economy inside the EU.
Germany will not be the biggest fan?
I'm not speaking on behalf of Germany. I'm just speaking on behalf of myself. But it's obvious that trade defense instruments cannot step in for competitive weakness and technological backwardness. I mean, if you try to use trade defense instruments to settle scores with China, where they have a technological advantage, I'm not sure you will be utterly successful. We failed in that regard in the past. We tried with solar. We followed the model that the US applied first. Anti-dumping measures on solar panels imported from China. What was the result? The result was that the big players in the Chinese market succeeded in outsourcing their production to Vietnam, Cambodia, and other countries, and kept supplying the American market, whereas the smaller players were not able to do that. So in the end, we helped monopolizing the Chinese solar industry. That was a great success. And then we followed suit in the Europe. After we'd seen that the Americans failed, we thought we should try again and fail also, which we did. I'm not sure that repeating that experience is so utterly promising. Look, Volkswagen has a market share of 19% overall in the Chinese market, based on their strength with the combustion engine. With regard to new energy vehicles, they're at 2.7%. And all the other mighty German OEMs are even below that. You cannot settle that score with trade defense instruments.
Yeah,
maybe, and Sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but I think on the principle we agree. So it's why I mentioned the NZR and the CRM Act, and also we have the issue of the reform of electricity market.
And
so
the Critical Raw Materials Act. And
sorry. So I think it's true that we don't solve all the problem with trade tool. And I think it's true that we need to say that. But I think that now it's why the European Parliament also push for the Net Zero industry, for the Critical Raw Material Act. But I think also in order to defend our competition at international level, we need also, before the election, to have the reform of energy market.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I certainly don't want to arbiter between Germany and France here, but I'm not quite sure if really anti-dumping duties should be the key element of the policy. It seems to me that the green agenda requires that there's much more access to electric vehicles in Europe and cheap electric vehicles in Europe, so that the green objectives can be achieved. And it seems that if we have to focus on using trade instruments, that looking at subsidies might be more directly addressing the concerns of the industry rather than using anti-dumping duties. And as was already mentioned, when using any of these trade tools, you need to make sure there's no circumvention. And that, I think, is very visible these days in what Commission does, is that it's not just focusing on the investigations, but then there's now a lot of follow-up investigations into, using the anti-circumvention tools, because that's now the key challenge. It's fine to impose the measures, but then you have to verify that they're not being circumvented.
Okay. Before we go to the audience, a last question for you, Mr. Boutikofer, if I may. You've explained why this specific thing is not a good idea, according to you. Are there other things that you think about that we should tackle through our new toolbox? There are a lot of options floating around: Chinese medical devices, Chinese railways. We have the first international procurement instrument investigation coming up. What would you advise the Commission to look into?
Well, the railways, that's lost. We're being crushed by CRRC, the big Chinese state-owned monopolist. That alone is twice as big as Alstom and Bombardier and Siemens combined with their rail business. And that's an example of where we might end up with our industries if we don't put in place protections against unfair competition. Because that success, that particular success, has been built on the basis of unfair competition, of stealing IP and all that. So I think we should not fool ourselves and try to be holier than the Pope as regards trade orthodoxy. We need to survive in a world of trade carnivores. And that means we have to be tough, but we have to be smart also. And I think being tough should be focused also, at least also, maybe even more than just halfway, on strengthening our own competitiveness. We talk about trade defense, and that's all okay, and I'm all for it. But if you just play defense, you never win a game. You have to score at least one goal if you want to win a game. So you have to play offense too, and that is fostering technological development. And I would rather focus on that than on trying to find another niche where we can battle it out. Of course, they're unfair with their practices as regards our health industry. And some of the unfair practices are not even put in writing. They're informal oral orders that are being given that no procurement should include Europeans, and there it goes. So I think we have to understand the limitations of the defense game that we play and effectively focus on the offense.
If I can play the commission now, I would say that this current commission is doing that with the Net Zero Industry Act, with the European Sovereignty Fund that is coming up, with the focus now.
Is it coming up?
In theory, it is. With the focus of the response to the IRA, if I understand you correctly, you're saying that it's far from enough. The next commission should do more.
Well, the Commission is certainly driving, but the real force is still the member states. That's where most political power resides. And if you don't get member states on board, whatever Commission and Parliament would want to see happening might still take a while. So I think the real issue is whether some governments that represent different traditions of environmental, economic, and trade thinking might find common cause. And I don't think it would be enough just to have a revitalization of the Franco-German axis. We have to bring others into the mold.
Okay. I've been informed that I have time for a couple of more questions before we return to the audience, so I just want to touch upon the multilateral aspect as well. Ms. Van Damme, when you look, we don't talk about, the Commission still talks about the WTO. We, talk about it a little bit less because it feels that not much is happening there. If you look at the trade toolbox that the EU has now built, what does that mean for the WTO and the multilateral trading system, you feel?
Well, the EU, of course, always says it continues to be a strong supporter of the multilateral trading system, and it definitely is investing a lot in advancing kind of the debates in the WTO, including to address the issue of the dispute settlement, so that more cases are being brought against again in the WTO. The fact of the matter is that the European Union, whether it's now for defensive or offensive interest, is taking more unilateral action. And that means two things. First of all, what is always the base for the justification for the action? And there, and I think we saw it this morning again in some reports, is to make everything regarding trade security related. And I do think that involves considerable risks. Because if the European Union does that, then a lot of other states also do that. And if everything becomes security related, I think we're kind of destroying the system from within, this multilateral system, because there'll be very few checks on what a trading partner does, on what the European Union does. So I think we need to be careful with using the security kind of label for every type of instrument. It is justified in certain contexts, but I don't think that everything in the entire trade policy must become a security policy also. And I think the European Union, in putting forward and using some of these instruments in a unilateral manner, kind of could sometimes be a bit more forthcoming about then explaining how this fits within the multilateral system. Because there's some gaps maybe in everyone's understanding of how the EU each time defends the use of these instruments.
Okay, you disagree?
Somewhat, yes. In principle, I agree, but in practice, I mean, the 232 tariffs from the US have been justified with security arguments. We feel it's been frivolous, but they're still there. We have a new administration, and they will remain in place. And even if we get a result before the end of the year or before the turn to another administration, I'm not sure that the 232 tariffs will completely fall. So we cannot just turn the other cheek.
I just want to pick up on that. That's why it's important to try to keep on strengthening the multilateral system, because the problem is that the US takes these measures today. They get condemned, but the EU can't currently retaliate because of the way in which dispute resolution works in Geneva right now. And how you get the US on board into that system is a very, very difficult conversation.
Yeah, what more can the EU
I have given up hope that the US will ever return to the trade multilateralism. If they would have been more constructive in working on the reform of the appellate body, or at least they would have been forthcoming to discuss MPIA. Neither of those options have ever earned serious consideration in Washington. So I think we cannot live by the gospel of returning to multilateralism. As much as we can defend it, we should, but we have to use other tools also.
Ms. Vedren, you want to?
I agree with Renat. Of course, I defend always the multilateralist system and WTO. I study WTO, and I think it's very important to strengthen the rule-based system. But we faced a lot of challenges, so it's why we need our autonomous measure. Like I said at the beginning, we need also to be credible if we want to defend the rule-based system. So if we don't have this kind of autonomous measure, in fact, we are not able to defend this system in World Trade Organization. So I think, of course, and we discussed during all the panels, the question of implementation, proportionality, but have our own tool, it's very important.
Okay, and if you look forward to the next commission, what more? Like we said in the beginning, you know, French pushed for a lot. They have gotten a lot. What more would you want to ask this new commission? We have the discussion about outbound investment screening, obviously, but are there other things that you would like to raise in a strategic outlook discussion?
I think a key priority for the French is miroir clauses, because it's also a question push for our citizen, for our enterprise, to implement really reciprocity. And I think it's also a question on sustainability. It's also a question of health. So I would like that all the commissioner, also health commissioner, trade commissioner, work on this issue together. I think if we want to be credible to our citizens, it's a key question. During the French presidency, we push a lot on this, and we have some concrete example, but I think it's not enough. If we want to have on board all the citizens of our trade policy.
Okay, go ahead.
I would say we've done quite some good work on the sticks. Now maybe we should also do some work on the carrots. And I would consider Global Gateway, the Global Gateway initiative, to be possibly a very interesting carrot. And I would want the new commission not to wait another 2 years before they pick it up, just as von der Leyen did. She could have picked it up immediately after Juncker left, and then it took her 2 years. Now she's fully engaged, and I'm very grateful for that, but the next commission has to deliver on that front.
Okay, definitely also a topic for our next session with Stuart on China and Europe's dependencies. We'll turn to the audience, which means that we'll close the live stream for now. Okay. Sorry, we're not closing the live stream, I apologize. But we'll still turn to the audience for questions. So happy to have a couple from in the room for each of our panelists. And otherwise, I will have some more, but I would love to hear from you on all of these issues. We have a mic who's there, and hopefully some people in the audience who are not afraid to ask questions. Yes, all the way in the back, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Bill Wirtz. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Consumer Choice Center. I had a quick question about what Mr. Bütikofer said about we have the most open, in terms of trade, the most open market in the world. I cover agriculture in my work, and it's certainly not true in agriculture. I mean, if you just compare subsidies, to which extent the European Union subsidizes agriculture, and the whole debate we have in the WTO now on that front. So I just wanted to know, like, how do you back that up? Like, which comparisons did you do to make the assessment that we are the most trade open?
Well, I completely agree with you. On ag, we cannot boast.
And does that need to change?
Ask our French.
I'm not here. I'm not here.
Do you want to or no? Too sensitive? Okay, well, I think that answer says a lot as well. Someone else? No? Okay, then I'll shoot another one before someone else has the courage to, to ask a question. One instrument that we haven't discussed yet is the international procurement instrument that you were also, I think both of you were at the forefront of organizing that. As that is coming up, what do you expect of it? Why is it so important? How does it fit into this toolbox? Because it feels like it has been a little bit out of the spotlights recently.
At the beginning, I was quite surprised when I arrived in the European Parliament to see how long it's played for the negotiation. 10 years of negotiation, it's quite crazy situation. So I think that now, because we have this instrument, we talk about foreign subsidy, we talk about anti-coercion, and of course, of public procurement, it's not just a question to adopt this kind of tool. We have to really think about how we implement this. So we talk, previously you talked about Chinese competition on some sector. I think that sometimes we need to really be focused on this instrument. But like Renat said since the beginning of his intervention, we need to have on board member states also on this instrument. Because we know that if we don't have also member states on this instrument, they don't want to move forward, and it will be very difficult for the Commission to really push for the activation of this tool. So I think also it's very important to discuss with all the stakeholders and to find the right balance in the use of this instrument.
Okay.
Well, I must confess that in the case of IPI, it was the German Chancellery that killed it 3 times before it was finally approved, because it was considered anti-competitive and protectionist, which I don't think it is. It's an implementation of the principle of reciprocity. Chinese state-owned enterprises are free to compete in our procurement markets as they wish, but in many sectors of the Chinese economy, we can't even compete. We're not even, our companies are not even allowed to join the procurement procedure. And if that continues on end, it creates a tilted and not a level playing field. When the Chinese government joined the WTO in 2001, they promised to join the procurement agreement, the international procurement agreement. They repeated the promise 17 times without yet delivering. And there was, I think it was very late, but it was the time to signal that we're going to push back. Reciprocity is not silver bullet to all the trade issues that we have with the Chinese. For instance, if they provide new risks for any competitive due diligence in their market because of the espionage law that they just passed, we would not certainly reciprocate. But with regard to procurement, I think reciprocity was the right principle, and that's what we implemented.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of next steps, how do you look at, what Ms. Vedren said, the member states coming together on now actually, not just having the instrument, but actually acting with the instrument?
Well, there are examples, and it's easy to imagine that member states might be torn. On one hand, you want to support European industry. On the other hand, if you allow a highly subsidized Chinese competitor into the procurement procedure, you might get the facility you want to build at a cheaper price. And that necessitates a balancing decision. Short term, maybe turning away from the problems and just looking the other way might be a better solution. But long term, that of course makes our industry go down the drain. And I think that means we have to develop a culture between member states. And one of the issues that we have bumped into several times has been the suspicion from smaller countries that these protective instruments would be used by more powerful European neighbors at their detriment. So would possibly investment screening or IPI measures be used to block something in Portugal, and then the French or the Germans step in? And I think we need to show a certain level of solidarity between member states also, if we don't want everybody to just, be selfish, act selfishly.
Okay. How do you look at this discussion within the 27?
Well, I think it brings us back to the beginning of our discussion on kind of the member states versus the European Union allocation of competences, because it's about the implementation of all of these instruments, as you said, and where do we put the focus, the member states or the Commission? And the example was given of FDI screening. The instruments talks about public order, public security, but in practice, actually, a lot of member states are applying screening also even to investments within the European Union. They apply their instrument, their national legislation for reviewing investments on grounds that go beyond what's stated under the EU regulation. So it brings us back to the issue of implementation, and how can we make at the implementation stage the application of these instruments as aligned as possible, so that you don't have the risk that was just described, but also that we are all still clear about what is the reason why we use the instrument, because with FDI screening at least, we see in practice that some member states use it for purposes that were not stated under the regulation.
Okay, thank you. I think we can wrap it up there. I would like to thank all three of you, Mr. Bütikofer, Mrs. Van Dam, Mrs. Verdren. I think we looked back, looked forward, looked to the immediate future this week. I would like to ask you all to remain seated because in a couple of minutes our next panel will start where Stuart Lau, our EU-China correspondent, will discuss Europe's dependencies. Thank you very much, and thank all three of you.
Thank you.